Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by BetDSI. Hey, you looking for a place to bet on NFL and NCAA football? BetDSI is the industry leader in football betting and the perfect sportsbook for both novice and professional bettors alike. New members get a 100% bonus match when you use the promo code SEATS100. Yeah, that's SEATS100 at betdsi.com. That's more than double your money to help start winning today. Once again, betdsi.com, promo code SEATS100, and get your limited time 100% bonus offer when you deposit today. Now, here's our show.
You are looking live at snow-swept Shea Stadium in New York, where the high-flying Jets play host to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and there is a controversy. Half of the field remains covered right now. The Jets insist it'll be clear in time for the kickoff. We are not so sure, but this field is going to be a problem from the Buccaneers, who have never played in conditions like this in December. Also, live, you are looking at Busch Stadium in St. Louis, where the Cardinals take on the Washington Redskins in a battle of playoff contenders. No snow, but it is very cold in St. Louis, and that field is frozen. And moving north into Wisconsin, we are now live at beautiful Lambeau Field in Green Bay, where the rejuvenated Packers with a 4-1 record take on the slumping Detroit Lions. The prediction, sunny skies in Green Bay.
One reason the St. Louis Cardinals have a winning record is because of their new defensive coach, Floyd Peters. I'll be taking a look at what he's done to put more muscle in a defense that last year was one of the worst in the NFL.
The Green Bay Packers are on their way to the best start since their Super Bowl years. I'll be talking about their game against the Lions today and other action around the NFL. Phyllis?
Jimmy, last season, after a poor start, the New York Jets caught fire and made the playoffs for the first time in 12 years. And they appear to be a cinch for a playoff berth again this season. I'll be looking at the man who gets the most credit for the Jets' dramatic turnaround, quarterback Richard Todd. We'll have all that and more on the NFL Today.
Sponsored by the 1983 Volkswagens. Nothing else is a Volkswagen. And by True Value Hardware Stores. True Value, more than just a name. It's our way of doing business. And now, here's Brent Musburger.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the NFL Today. Feels like football here in New York. Let me assure you of that.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, you are listening live. Well, not really live, somehow podcasted or streamed or downloaded or whatever, but we appreciate it. Hi there, my name is Tim Hanlon, and you have found Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for coming on by. We appreciate it. And make no mistake, you know what we're in for this week. We're going to talk about perhaps one of the foundational television programs in and around professional television sports, that being the NFL Today on CBS. Yes, a show that we know today and watch regularly to get us set for the various now AFC games that CBS has the exclusive Sunday window for the NFL. But back in the day, in the 1970s, the retooling of what was a much more modest pre-game setup by CBS, a longtime broadcaster of NFL football games dating all the way back to, I think it's 1961, and various, more traditional sort of pre-recorded kinds of pre-game setups for various NFL broadcasts on the weekends. 1974, CBS abandoned the pre-recorded sort of format, and I think it was called Pro Football Report back in the day, for something more fresh, shall we say. It became a more live and wraparound style program. They called it, for at least that 1974 season, the NFL on CBS. It was a half hour, and it was much more devoted to kind of closer to real-time, game-time information, kind of setting up with a half hour's notice what was going to go on in that single header or double header that was to await the national fans on CBS that Sunday. And that, of course, was the NFC games package that CBS had for such a long period of time. But it really broke ground, as we're going to get into our conversation this week with our guest, Rich Podolsky. He a writer on this newer version. In 1975, it was renamed the NFL Today. Now, that was also its name a couple of different times during the 60s and 70s, back and forth. The names kept changing and the formats kept getting tweaked. But make no mistake, in 1975, the signature imprint that truly took this broadcast and all of sports pregame shows, for that matter, to the complete next level. And that, is sort of evidenced in that clip from 1982, gives you a sense of how that format ran and the people involved. It became much more of a lifestyle and entertainment kind of approach, with four major personalities, all bringing their own sort of perspectives and unique skill sets to the mix to create, frankly, something that became, for most people on Sundays, dare I say this, for fans of the NBC AFC package pregame show that they had, was really kind of must-see TV for any NFL sports fan. People such as Brent Musburger, obviously well-known. You kids today know him as the voice of VSiN, the sports betting media company. Perhaps you may remember him from calling Rose Bowl games and lots of different things for ABC Sports. Well, before that, kids, Brent Musburger was a mainstay at CBS Sports, calling all kinds of games and action, NBA games, NFL games, and that kind of stuff. But really got his start as a sportscaster and anchorman for two CBS-owned and operated stations, one WBBM in Chicago and the other KCBS television in Los Angeles, before he went to CBS Network and was tapped to be the host of this newfangled, newly rechristened NFL Today in 1975. And extraordinary, right? Just kind of built for the job. Born into it, if you will. Brent Musburger was a sportscaster's sportscaster and the chief ringleader, frankly, for amongst three other personalities that, in many cases sort of kind of needed a little direction once in a while. One of which was a guy by the name of Jimmy the Greek Snyder, a character, to say the least, a gambler through and through, and was frankly the avatar for what is now, you kids today, the sort of now blending of betting with pro sports. Now, you have to remember, back in the 1970s, there was sort of this winking and nodding, admission, not admission, that gambling was part of sort of the sports culture and NFL games specifically. But of course, it was never legal in any way, shape, or form, except in Las Vegas. But that didn't stop odds makers and various personalities, no more larger than life than this Jimmy the Greek Snyder character, who literally brought sort of that sort of betting, if you will, sensibilities. Frankly, it's how I learned the word when I was growing up, the word intangibles. If you remember Jimmy the Greek, when he would go through that sort of tote board of like what to look for with Brent as they went through game by game, what to look for and getting that sort of quote unquote betting edge. There's always that last thing called intangibles. I never knew what the hell that meant, but I soon learned it was all those sort of things that didn't neatly fit onto either offensive or defensive stats and that kind of stuff. Another person, and a high wattage, high voltage one at that, was not only somebody not from the realm of sports, but just an absolute gorgeous distraction and attraction, and a former Miss America at that. Her name, Phyllis George. Did she know much about sports? No, not really. Football? Certainly not. But she was a breath of fresh air and a wonderful balance to these sports guys, one a sportscaster and one a sort of a betting guy. And she brought the sort of element of features and softer side of the game, and frankly made the show a lot more accessible to women and people more casually attracted to the NFL. And a wonderful personality in her own right. Now, she left for a couple of years, replaced by another gorgeous woman and a Miss America herself, Jane Kennedy. We get into that story with Rich, too. But then Phyllis came back in 1980 and sort of rode along with the show for years thereafter. But make no mistake, she was certainly part of the mix as well. And last but certainly not least, an actual gosh darn football player, somebody who actually had experience on the field, and probably the quietest, most stable of all these personalities, the glue, if you will, of the show, and somebody probably, frankly, with the most insightful understanding of the game itself. Irv Cross, former Philadelphia Eagle standout, Pro Football Hall of Famer he, and who after the NFL today went on to a stellar career in collegiate athletics administration. But Irv Cross, I think, sort of the unsung hero of this, shall we call them, fearsome foursome of this NFL today. They reigned for a good 10, almost 15 years, and truly recast what the idea of a pregame show should look like. And you heard the excitement in Brent Musburger's voice, going live to each individual game and getting people set up. It became an event. And make no mistake, as we'll get into our conversation with Rich in just a few moments, not everybody got along with each other at every single moment of those broadcasts, because these were all, strong personalities. But that's what made it watchable television. That's what it made it a must-see kind of a thing. You never kind of really knew what was going to happen, how combustible it might be. And for those who lived through it in the 1970s and early 1980s, the NFL Today on CBS was the pregame show to watch. And we're going to get into the history, the story of it, with one of its head writers, and frankly, just a wealth of knowledge. I mean, this guy knows everything and then some amazing tidbits. Rich Podolsky. And the book, it's coming out next week, folks. Get your pre-order now or order it now, depending on when you're listening. It's called, well, you can probably imagine, You Are Looking Live, How the NFL Today Revolutionized Sports Broadcasting. This is a fun conversation. You're going to learn so much. Get your pens and paper ready, because there's going to be so many tidbits that you've never heard of before. And it's only scratching the surface of what's in store for you when you get this book. Our conversation with Rich Podolsky coming up in 1.5 moments time. You will enjoy this. Let's see. How about a sponsor this week? Let's go with, all right, let's go to Southwest Missouri, shall we? Hey, Judd, it's your turn. Judd Lasher, here you go. It's 417 Helmets, collectible helmets and more at 417helmets.com. That's 417helmets.com. And like the name implies, friends, you've got to check out this site, 417helmets.com. It is the treasure trove of all treasure troves. Mini helmets of football from all kinds of pro leagues, both current and, of course, inglorious past. We're talking World Football League. We're talking United States Football League. We're talking United Football League. We're talking all kinds of franchises, current and past. And we're talking also collegiate of all shapes and sizes, whether they be football bowl series, or what is that? Division, whatever Division I is called, the bowl championship, the bowl championship series, or the whatever, Division II, whatever division they're in. I can't even keep up with them anymore. The bowl championship division, that's what it is. Or the whatever it is, you're yelling into your devices. You know what it is. I'm telling you, there are teams out there that you even know existed, Slippery Rock State, whatever. They're all there for you to purchase. You're going to just fall in love with them once you go to 417helmets.com. And of course, you're going to stick around and you're going to buy more stuff while you're there when you use the promo code for 10% off. And that's Good Seats. The promo code is Good Seats at 417helmets.com. Hey, look, and if for whatever reason you can't even find something that you think you're interested in, a team or from a league that, might be interesting to you, you can have one made custom. And frankly, it doesn't even have to be a football team. It can be another sports team, or it could be your company logo, or it could be something else that you devise. Judd can make anything you want in a mini custom helmet kind of fashion, and it's high quality stuff. It's the exact same stuff that the pros wear on their big heads, the actual real size ones. So enjoy the conversation piece that is a mini collectible helmet. Once again, for 17helmets.com, promo code GOODSEATS, 10% off every stinking purchase. And we thank Judd for his sponsorship of the show. We apologize for our ignorance of what the various divisions of the NCAA are this week. It kind of really doesn't matter, it seems, because the NCAA is certainly waning in its influence. We'll see what happens in the next year or two, but whatever. I digress. Let's waste no more time. Enough with this NCAA college game. Let's talk about the NFL, and let's talk about the NFL today, and let's talk about the NFL today on CBS with the author of the great and fascinating and must-get book, You Are Looking Live. Here's our conversation with Rich Podolsky that we had just last week. Sit back, enjoy. This is a fun one. Here it comes. Enjoy.
In 1975, I was covering the Miami Dolphins for the Palm Beach Post. And I got a call one day that my parents had been in a car accident and that they were both in the hospital. And I had to leave that job. I had been covering the Dolphins for a few years through their Super Bowl, through their second Super Bowl. And it was a great job. And one of the people I got to know real well at the job was Bino Cook, who was the public relations director at that time.
Legendary.
Legendary. The legendary Bino Cook, yes. And I had to leave the job, go back to Philadelphia. Unfortunately, my father passed away 2 days later. It was his third heart attack. My mother had multiple injuries and was in the hospital for over a month and rehabilitating for 6 months after. And it was basically my job to take care of her since my sister was living in Texas. So that's where all this started. I wound up after she was on her own for a little while. I was able to go out and get a job with the Suburban Daily. And I stayed in touch with Bino. Bino was my lifeline. He had thrilled me with his stories about ABC Sports and about the great world of college football and the television part of it, how he had been able to convince ABC Sports to move the Texas-Arkansas game from the first scheduled game of the year until December, because he told them that they would play for the national championship, and they did, with Nixon presenting the trophy to the winner. So Bino was a great friend and a great lifeline, and he told me he was going back to public relations, and he was going to take a job with a show called The Superstars, which was created by Dick Button. Now, The Superstars, some of your fans might remember, was a show that featured star athletes who were competing in events that they were not professional in. For example, Joe Frazier was there among 10 athletes, and he ran track, and he did anything but box. Apparently, he did not swim very well on that show. But that's the main idea. Pete Rose played tennis, things like that.
Yeah, we actually had Kyle Rote Jr. on early, about 2 years ago. Fantastic story. He's a multi-winner of that show, soccer player, and really so fascinating stories there. And hopefully we go deeper on that. But it was a great conversation. A fantastic event.
Yeah. So Bino was doing public relations or publicity for that show, which was taped in Florida, Rotunda, Florida, which was a housing development there. I guess they were trying to sell homes. And he called me. I was in Philadelphia, where I was living with my mother. And he called me and said, Barry Frank just took over as the new head of CBS Sports. Barry Frank was an executive that worked with Bino and Bino's 10 years at ABC Sports. And he said, I think Barry's going to hire me to do publicity for CBS. And if that happens, I'm going to convince Dick Button to hire you to do the publicity job that I had. I said, great. I'd love to get involved in television one way or another. And that happened. He brought me in. Dick Button really had no choice the way Bino presented it. And he hired me. Button was partners with the people at IMG who were producing the show, the Superstars. And it was really great fun for me and a terrific job. And I knew a ton of sports writers, and I was able to call them and get material done for the show and stories. And I got to meet Don Ohlmeyer, who was a great, great producer, and he went on to become a great executive at both ABC and NBC in later years. And Ohlmeyer was producing the Superstars, and he was kind enough to let me go in the truck and watch what he did. And then when they got all the tapes back to New York, he allowed me to come into the studio and watch him edit. And in those days, there was no digital. When you edited a piece of tape, you had to guess where it started and then where it ended, and then to go back and forth until you finally got the right parts to start and finish it. It was a tedious process, and Ohlmeyer was a genius at the editing. In fact, in the book, I mentioned that they had a show called Battle of the Network Stars, which was a takeoff on the Superstars, where they had stars from all three networks trying athletic events. And it was kind of a fun show to watch these people try to compete. And Ohlmeyer opened the show with a helicopter view of 3 lines of limousines coming from 3 different directions, all meeting at this one battleground of the 3 networks.
I think it was Pepperdine University in Malibu, right?
Yeah, it was an amazing opening, and only Ohlmeyer was creative enough to come up with it. So I got my taste of television. I absolutely loved it, and I wanted more. And one day while I was on the job there for about 3 months, Bino got in touch with me and said, they need a new writer at CBS Sports, and I'm going to convince them to hire you. Now, I had no experience writing anything for television, other than public relations pieces. So one thing led to another. I got the interview. The articles that I sent in the past were good enough. I had actually won a Keystone Award, which was the Pennsylvania Publishers Award for Best Sports Story of the Year earlier in the 70s. So I had some good things that represented me when the head of communications at CBS Sports was doing the interviewing. And that, along with Bino and Mike Pearl, was the producer of the NFL Today. We knew each other from Miami and the Dolphins. and he recommended me as well. And in fact, I would have to be writing copy for the NFL Today, and he said he was fine with it. So I wound up getting the job almost by default, and it was an incredible thrill for a guy like me to be working on sports television. And that was June of 1977 when I got to CBS Sports. Now, the NFL Today show that I write about, it took a dramatic turn in 1975 when Bob Wessler took over as the head of CBS Sports, and he brought in Mike Pearl from WTVGA in Miami to be the producer and to put it together.
Yeah, and
what do you want to talk about next?
Yeah, well, so, I mean, so much to unpack there, but yeah, so 75-ish, right? Obviously, a couple of years before you arrive on the scene. I mean, I think it's not unimportant to kind of sort of emphasize just how significant a change it was. It was essentially kind of a reinvented pregame show from earlier, shall we say, more primitive approaches, where live became more of the dynamic and a wraparound kind of style. Which was at that time in '75 quite new and fresh, right, and frankly unproven.
Well, before 1975, the only thing that was live were the games themselves. All the pregame shows were shot days in advance, and all the announcers were middle-aged white men. And Wessler's really vision was not only to have a live pregame show, but to have tremendous diversity as well. He wanted a three-pronged announce team to be co-hosts. And in so doing, he brought in the first woman ever on a live show. That was Phyllis George, a former Miss America. And she wound up parting the Red Sea for women broadcasters after her. He then also brought in Irv Cross to be the first person of color on this type of show. Irv had previously been the first person of color as an analyst on NFL games. And of course, and the third person he had was the incomparable Brent Musburger, who we brought in from Chicago's WBBM, which was Wessler's previous job for CBS. He was the general manager of the Chicago TV station there, and he was well familiar with how brilliant Musburger was. Now, the interesting thing was, it wasn't until a year later that Wessler had the nerve and the gall and the audacity to add to that cast Jimmy the Greek Snyder to talk about gambling and to talk around point spreads. The Greek was already a celebrity going back to the 40s. In 1948, he had won $1 million betting on Harry Truman. He bet $50,000, which was a hell of a lot of money then. He bet $50,000 on Truman at 20-1 odds. And when Truman won the election against Governor Dewey of New York, it made national news when Walter Winchell, who was probably the most powerful media person in the country, went on his radio show and said, Mr. and Mrs. North and South America and all the ships at sea, the big winner, besides Harry Truman, was a young Greek boy, 29-year-old Jimmy Snyder from Steubenville, Ohio, who won $1 million betting on Truman. Now, that was the first time anybody in the country had heard of Jimmy the Greek. And the reason he did that, I know I'm going off on a tangent here.
No, this is great.
But the reason he did that was about a month prior to the election, he was shaving, and his sister noticed, she said, "Why are you growing a mustache? Women hate mustaches. It reminds them of Hitler." And he said, "Oh, that's interesting." And then the next thing he did is he turned around and looked at the front page of the newspaper, and there was a big picture of Governor Dewey, and all the Greek saw was Dewey's mustache. And it hit him that, my God, Dewey might lose. That because women, more women voted than men. And the next thing he did is he hired 3 women to go out and do kind of raw kind of research outside the A&P in Steubenville. And he knew Ohio was a major state as far as the elections go. And he found out that out of 500 women interviewed, that there were only about 100 that actually liked men with mustaches. Most of the rest of them did not. So he went out and did a little more research, spent a little more money, confirmed all this, and then he went to New York, Lindy's restaurant, famous for their cheesecake, where Damon Runyon and all the bookies hung out in the 40s. And he wound up betting with 3 different bookies, getting odds anywhere from 17 to 22 to 1 on Truman. And when I asked him why he took the 17 to 1 odds, he said, a friend guaranteed me that guy would pay. So it wound up they all paid. The Greek had an enormous amount of money. I mean, $1 million then was probably worth about $300 million today. He blew some of it on oil wells, but then he went out to Las Vegas and opened up some bookie shops, sports betting, which we call today. And he was extremely successful. And one of the reasons he was so successful is he made the best numbers in Las Vegas, probably the best numbers in the country, betting numbers, that is. And a little while after this, when the Kennedys took over in the early 60s, Bobby Kennedy was the attorney general. He went after Sam Giancana and the mafia, had little success actually nailing them, and decided he had to do something. And he wound up getting Jimmy the Greek for talking on the phone across state lines and discussing point spreads. Now, what simply happened was a friend of his from Utah called and wanted to know what Jimmy's opinion would be on the Utah State game. And when Jimmy gave him a spread that he thought would be fair, they arrested him. They took away his gambling license, and he was out in the cold and had to find something to make a living. He walked into the Las Vegas Sun. Hank Greenspan was the editor, and he convinced Greenspan to let him write a column with his numbers, man-to-man numbers on football and baseball and basketball. And the column became so popular, it got syndicated in over 300 newspapers. And by the early and mid-'70s, the Greek was more popular than ever.
And I'm guessing that's how Wussler kind of circled on him. Let me just ask you this, and I know this is before your arrival, but I think it's a helpful entree into it, right? But and I don't want to overly focus on Jimmy the Greek, but I'm curious as to, as you're working with Wussler, when you sort of came in, what did Wussler see in this guy versus, say, others sort of in the quote unquote gambling realm? And then number 2, the controversial move of bringing somebody who's essentially legitimizing gambling, obviously legal in Vegas and Nevada at the time, but nowhere else. That right. In itself was a big deal.
The Greek had moved to Miami, and in Miami he met Mike Pearl. And Mike Pearl, as I mentioned, was a great producer, and he wound up producing the Greek's radio spots. Besides the 300 newspapers that the Greek had the column in, the Greek became so popular. He had like a 5-minute radio show that was also syndicated, and he and Mike Pearl got along famously. Pearl had seen what a tremendous, bigger-than-life character the Greek was, and how no matter where he went, people wanted to talk to him and they didn't feel like they couldn't say, "Hey, Greek, what do you know?" Or what do you think about the Dolphins this week? The Greek was a tremendously likable guy, and when Mike Pearl came to CBS, the Greek wanted to bring a commercial for El Producto cigars to the NFL Today, where he would be the spokesperson for it in a 30-second ad. Wessler met him through that ad and realized what a tremendous asset he could be. Wessler wasn't worried about the NFL. The NFL forbade any talk about point spreads. Pete Rozelle went before Congress that year and guaranteed Congress that this wouldn't happen. He told Congress, you don't have anything to worry about. Only 2% of our viewers actually bet on the games. Well, when Beano Cook heard that, Beano said, well, if that's true, they all live on my block. Well, the Greek joined the cast in '76, and you wound up having 4 people with tremendous personalities, and some of them were very explosive. The show was incredibly, incredibly successful to start with. America had never seen anything like this before. Besides going live and besides having all these different personalities and people of color and a woman for the first time, Wessler had previously said that TV sports had become a male ghetto, and he wanted an opportunity to get women involved in the show. And he didn't want them just sitting at home opening beer cans for their husband. He wanted them interested, and Phyllis George and her personality profiles got them interested. The NFL Today expanded the audience not only for its own show, but for pro football in its entirety, and it really helped the NFL overtake baseball as America's #1 sport.
All right, what's this? Lucy nicotine. Yes. Well, hey, look, folks, we're all adults here, and some of us choose to use nicotine to relax, focus, or just unwind after a long day. And Lucy Nicotine is a company that was created to help nicotine users find a cleaner option and feel better about the ways they consume nicotine. Now, look, I'm not a smoker. I've not been a chewing tobacco kind of guy. We all know that nicotine is absolutely endemic to those activities. You look, if you're looking to evolve, say, from the smoking habit, but recognize that nicotine is part of the mix, well, perhaps Lucy Nicotine is a helpful way to evolve from those habits. Their latest product is called Slim Nicotine Pouches, which contain pure synthetic nicotine and provide the same satisfaction that nicotine users expect without any tobacco at all. Lucy Slim Pouches use the newest technology for synthesizing, he says, pure nicotine in the lab, none of the tobacco and all of the nicotine satisfaction. They come in 3 strengths, 4, 8, and 12 milligrams, and 3 exclusive and inviting flavors, spearmint, mango, and cool cider. So don't compromise when you're choosing your nicotine products. Go with the newest tobacco-free options from Lucy Nicotine. And my listeners can go to lucy.co and use the promo code GOODSEATS to get 20% off your order of Lucy Slim Pouches or any other of the Lucy nicotine products. That's lucy.co and use promo code GOODSEATS at checkout. Now, I got to use this disclaimer. Warning, this product contains non-tobacco nicotine, and nicotine is an addictive chemical. Thank you, Lucy Nicotine, for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. I think a word you may have mentioned, or I'll sort of throw in there, and maybe I'll use this as a segue, as you walk in the door to this new cool, and I'm sure high wattage assignment that you're probably getting very excited and eager for, is the word combustible, right? Because certainly with those 4 personalities, I would argue, and it seemed to me based on my recollections of that show, that there was almost an expectation that there would be either friendly or not so friendly, but friction nonetheless that would drive the dynamic of that show regardless. And that must have been a bit intimidating for you, no?
Not for me. I wasn't one of the four fighting for airtime. It was a half-hour show in those days, and there were really only 22 minutes of airtime. And the more popular the show got, the more money some of them got as salaries. And, that they started fighting for airtime. And the Greek always felt like he was getting the short end of the stick. Because while they were on the air, actually, even though things were sort of laid out or scripted, you might say, Brent had complete control if he wanted to throw it to Irv for another piece of information, or if he wanted to throw it to Phyllis for her point of view. Every once in a while, he'd say, Greek, how much do you think they'd be favored by? And Greek would get around the point spread thing by saying, a touchdown or maybe a field goal. Or he'd say, what does the golfer say when he hits it out of bounds? Oh, yeah, he says 4. And that's how they got around the point spread thing. But the Greek always felt like he was the last one Brent would go to. And that eventually led to their big disagreement and what I titled Chapter 10 in the book, The Fight at Pear Trees in 1980, in October of 1980.
All right. Well, before I want to get into some of the other personalities. I think Jimmy the Greek will kind of sort of circle back on because he's kind of an interesting, shall we say, bookmark to all this. But give me a sense of what day to day was like, right? You're obviously not fighting for the airtime, but you gotta kind of at least somehow write, if you will, at least it's scripted form before the light goes on. You got to write for these people, right? So
my job was easy.
Okay.
Really, when it came down to it. Because the only thing that they actually needed scripted were lead-ins to the opening whip around, which is when they went from stadium into stadium, and Brent would say, "You are looking live at Soldier Field in Chicago," etc. And so I was writing the lead-ins for those 4 stadium shots, and then the lead-ins for any tape piece that they would have to lead into. And they did several tape pieces a show. They would send Phyllis and Irv out every week with NFL films producing the pieces for them. And Irv would usually do a player to talk about game strategy, and Phyllis would usually do a star athlete like Roger Staubach, and they'd sit in the living room and they'd talk about personal things. And so I only had to write the lead-ins and be around and pay attention to any news that was happening and get that information to Brent if and when that occurred.
Well, let's talk about Brent Musburger, right? Because obviously he's the glue of that show. He's the anchor, if you will, of that show. Maybe just to give us a sense of sort of him. Obviously, well known in local Chicago circles at the time. Northwestern grad, a writer, sports writer of note. Was this? I'm trying to remember. Was this kind of his first kind of national network kind of gig? And how was he to work for and or write for? I'm assuming you didn't have to do much writing for him, if at all.
Well, I had to write the stadium openings, the whip around. He didn't have any features, so but I wrote those the opening lines every week, and I bring it to him, and he'd say, "Oh yeah, this is okay," or he'd tweak it, or whatever. I mean, he was not difficult to write for, but Brent was a really interesting guy. I mean, he was more than the glue; he was the cog that made the whole ship run. Brent actually did not graduate from Northwestern. He was in the same class as Irv Cross, and I believe they did briefly know each other at Northwestern. But Irv kidded him that Irv actually graduated, and Brent left with a year to go be a sports writer first in DeKalb, and then he took a job as a sports reporter for the Chicago American, and graduated to become a columnist there. And his career took a tremendous turn in 1968 when he was asked by WBBM Radio in Chicago to see if he could cover the Mexico City Olympics. And when they asked him to do it, it was too late for him to get a credential. So he borrowed somebody else's, and he got in. And he cornered John Carlos and Tommy Smith right after their famed black glove salute. And he cornered them in the athletes' quarters, which was off limits to the press. He got a 12-minute piece of tape, and within an hour or two, that tape made it on stations all over the country, and Brent Musburger was famous. And when he got back, WBBM offered him more than twice as much as he was making at the Chicago American as a columnist. Now, Brent loved being a columnist and really didn't want to leave the job. And he thought if he went into his boss, the sports editor, and said, look, he was making $13,500, and they offered him like $28,000. He went in and hoped, well, if they offer me $10,000 more, I'll stay. He didn't even want them to match. And when he went in and told him about it, his boss said, "Are you crazy? Nobody leaves a column." And Brent did. Brent had a wife, and they wanted to start a family, and Brent took the money, and he was a natural doing all these different radio shows and opinion pieces for WBBM Radio. And within a year, he had moved to take over as sports director of the TV side. Van Gordon Sauter was the news director at that time. Van Gordon Sauter wound up being the head of CBS Sports in 1980 and the head of the network after that. But at that time, Van actually was the one who hired Brent. Van described Brent as a natural. He was just an outright natural. And Brent said, he was lucky. It came to him easily. He never took any classes at Northwestern in broadcasting, and he loved the job. And it became evident how good he was at it. In 1973 and 4, he did some games as a play-by-play guy for CBS Sports, NFL games I'm talking about. But he had like the 5th or 6th game, and it was hard to get noticed when you were that far down the line. And he did an occasional CBS Sports Spectacular as well. But his big break came when in 1974, Jack Whitaker was hosting the NFL Today. Jack had an assignment to do the Irish Derby that weekend, and they brought in Brent. Now, they were trying to do it live at that point in 1974 with a producer by the name of Bill Fitz, Fitts, who had been at CBS Sports since around 1968 or even before that. He was trying to do it live. He was having a lot of difficulty because, as he said, the pace of the show was just too fast for Jack Whitaker. They brought in Brent on this one weekend, and they said for Brent it was like a kid in a candy store. Everything was easy. He was a sensation, and they knew that Brent was the future of the show. But when Whitaker came back, they weren't going to move him out of the position. He had been so loyal to CBS Sports for so many years. In fact, for many, many of those years, Jack Whitaker was the face of CBS Sports and did play-by-play for the half of the very first Super Bowl for CBS. So that's where it's
Jack Whitaker is almost like I call him almost like the poet laureate of CBS Sports. He did something. Whitaker did a great soliloquy at the end of the famous Pelé first game in 1975 for the New York Cosmos, literally live on the field after the game had done. And it was basically set the tone for American soccer and its future and stuff. And it was, he's a wonderful discovery or rediscovery if folks out there have never really sort of experienced Jack Whitaker essays and commentary, for sure. A legend.
I go into quite a bit of Jack's background as well in the first chapter of the book, which is called CBS Sports. That's the way it was. Just to go off on a quick tangent, Jack landed in Normandy the third day of the invasion. So his dream of being a radio host went down the tubes when he got injured twice. When he got back, he got a job as a radio guy in, I think it was Allentown, Pennsylvania. He was bored to death because all he did was interview the mayor and the pastor in that town. And one day he walked into the newsroom and heard Ben Hogan playing in the Murray U.S. Open in 1950. But it wasn't radio. It was a newfangled invention called television. And he said to himself, that's what I should be doing. He quit his job the next day, went back to Philadelphia, walked into WCAU, and got a job as a sports director. His best friend at WCAU was Ed McMahon. They dominated the late news show every night at 11 o'clock, along with the voice of Lambeau Field, John Facenda from NFL Films. And the three of them had the top ratings in Philadelphia until the CBS network bought WCAU, decided they didn't want a half-hour newscast. They cut it back to 15 minutes. They cut out sports. They cut out all of Ed McMahon's commentaries. And the two of them thought they were going to be out of work. And they started, the two, Ed McMahon and Whitaker, started taking the train to Philadelphia every morning, showing up at the ad agencies, which controlled hiring at TV stations. And they tried to get jobs with the networks, and they were successful. McMahon got a job as an announcer on a new game show called Who Do You Trust, which had a guy named Johnny Carson as the host. And when Carson got the Tonight Show, he took McMahon with him. And Whitaker got a job with CBS doing analysis on NFL games on Sundays. And that led to hosting CBS Sports Spectacular, hosting golf, hosting tennis for the network. And pretty soon, he was on the network almost as much as Walter Cronkite. So he was pretty famous by 1974 when they tried to move him to the host of the NFL Today, and he really couldn't handle that very well. And that's when they all knew Brent was the future of the network. Wussler came in, and Wussler moved Brent in, and it all became history after that.
So Musburger's the natural, right? How about let's talk about something like Phyllis George, right? Almost the complete opposite. Gender, experience, if you will, in sports, personality, and I have to think, but I don't know, probably need a little bit more sort of writing help and or research and stuff. Or was she a natural in her own way, too, in terms of the subject matter?
She was a natural in her own way. When she won the Miss America in 1971, Miss America was a huge deal in our country. It was on prime time on Saturday nights. It got enormous ratings. And you have to remember there were only three channels in those days, ABC, CBS, and NBC. And there was no cable, no round-the-clock news, nothing else, no internet. Phyllis George became famous when she won Miss America, and she was so likable that they brought her back to co-host with Bert Parks every year after that. Now, when she won, they sent her on a 22-day trip to Vietnam with the next 6 runners up. And they did song and dance numbers for the troops. It was kind of really sweet how they entertained the troops. But Phyllis learned to deal with the press during that trip. She had to answer questions about should we be in Vietnam. Then when she got back and started doing her annual tour for Miss America, she had to answer questions about the women's lib groups that were following her around because they thought Miss America was an insult to women. And Phyllis actually wound up talking to them and telling them one day when actually it was in DeKalb, Illinois, she invited them in. They were outside picketing. And she said, look, I'm a real beneficiary of this. I needed the scholarship money. I wanted to have an opportunity to get into broadcasting, and that's what it's doing for me. And I could understand your point of view, but it's helping me. So she knew how to fight for her own self, and she knew how to deal with the press. So when she came to New York to try to get a job in broadcasting, she was doing some modeling, and she met a couple of young producers at CBS named Bob Stenner and Tommy O'Neill. And they hit it off right away, and they became fast friends. And eventually O'Neill and Stenner introduced her to Wussler and had recommended her to Wussler. And Wussler took her to lunch one day, and they were getting along great. And you could see right away how likable she was and how approachable she was. And while she was beautiful, she didn't wear a lot of makeup. She was kind of like the girl next door, and she was friendly, and she wasn't snobbish. And Wussler really had a great feeling about her, and he asked her the $24 question, what do you know about sports? Well, Phyllis was not a sports expert, to say the least, but she had the right answer. She said, well, I've dated a number of athletes in my time, and coming from Texas, of course, I'm a huge fan of the Dallas Cowboys and Hook 'em Horn, the Hook 'em Horn University of Texas. So
TCU, actually. I think TCU, where she graduated.
She did not graduate from TCU.
Oh, really? I thought it was
no.
Okay, interesting.
I'd have to go back to see in my book, but she didn't graduate. She left to come to New York in 73 or 74, and she got a job, a few jobs modeling, and then she got a job on a show called Candid Camera with Alan Funt.
Oh, sure. Syndicated.
And she was second banana to Alan Funt. And she was terrific on the show, but it really was not her cup of tea. And when Wussler offered her a 13-week contract to see if she could do become a person in the sports world on the network, she grabbed at it. Now, Wussler had tried previously to hire Jane Chastain from WTVJ in Miami, where Jane had done an awful lot of work and was really a sports expert. But when they put her on he put her on an actual NFL game with Don Criqui and Irv Cross, and the mail that came in was so negative. In fact, I wound up doing a TV guide piece on Jane and the mail that came in, and the name of the piece for TV Guide was titled "Get That Broad Out of the Booth." That wasn't my choice of words. That was what many of the letters were saying. And Wussler was not worried that a woman would work just because it didn't work with Jane. He tried it another way with Phyllis, and they sent her out to interview Dave Cowens of the Boston Celtics. And Cowens didn't want to do the interview. He didn't like doing interviews. And he especially didn't want to do an interview with a woman. And she wouldn't give up. She followed him out of practice. She jumped in his Jeep. And, the team had told him that he had to do the interview. So he let her get in his Jeep. And they drove to his place, wherever that was in the country. And the producers followed in their car. And by the time they got to his place, she had peppered him with so many questions, she was wearing him down. And she started asking him things that weren't on the list of the producer's questions. She started asking him, what would it feel like if you didn't have this anymore? What would it feel like if you were hurt and you couldn't play basketball anymore? What would you do? What would your life be like? Where would you go? Personal stuff that he had never talked about before, and a sports writer wouldn't dare ask him in 1974, 1975. This was actually the early winter of 75, and the piece wound up being what Melissa Lutke of Sports Illustrated called the best national piece ever done on Dave Cowens. She had gotten great material out of him, and she was surprised herself at the great reception it got. Now, they sent her out to do a piece with Jimmy Connors, with Elvin Hayes, and with a few other athletes as well. They were all along the same line, great personal stuff. These guys became relaxed with her, and they knew they had something with Phyllis George. And within a month, Wussler had decided he was going to put her on the NFL Today, along with Brent and Irv Cross. And within a year, she was on the cover of People magazine.
And the dynamic among those four, obviously being the only woman in a sort of very still testosterone-driven kind of sort of culture and stuff, she got along pretty famously with them on the air, and I'm guessing off the air too, no?
Yeah, pretty much. Phyllis was not going to get shorted on airtime. That was for sure. Director Bob Fishman said she was the greatest close-up in his history of being a director.
And that didn't irk any of the guys, frankly?
That didn't hurt them at all. And they found a way to kind of, I hesitate to use the word, but hide her. They didn't make her be involved in any X's and O's stuff. And, after a couple of months, she started to feel comfortable joining the conversation, and when they were talking about strategy, they'd have the camera on Brent and the Greek or Brent and Irv, and they wouldn't show Phyllis. So it was not a difficult thing for her to adjust to. And America really loved her. Her sweetness and her personality just burst through the lens. And when they wound up going on the road later in the season, it became obvious when she was the one everybody ran up to and wanted an autograph from. Greek was number 2. And pretty much nobody asked Brent for his autograph. And Mike Pearl and Bob Fishman thought that Brent might have been a little jealous. Why did she leave in 78? What was the situation there and her coming back in 80? I forgot sort of the dynamic of that. In 78, she married the head of Paramount Studios.
Oh, yeah, Robert Evans. The kid stays in the picture.
Right, exactly. Bob Evans. And it was strange because people were trying to get her to meet John Y. Brown, who had made a killing with Kentucky Fried Chicken. And they had arranged a blind date at the Hernando's Lounge in the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. But before they could even sit down and get to know each other, Howard Cosell, who was there, jumped in and sat at their table and interrupted. And then Warren Beatty, who was living in the hotel, did the same. John Y. Brown and Phyllis George really never got to know each other. And that relationship was put aside for a number of years. And instead, she wound up meeting Evans and marrying Evans. She was, I believe, the fourth of 7 wives for Evans. His previous wife was, Ally McGraw, the star of The Getaway with Steve McQueen. And after McQueen met McGraw, they did make their own getaway, and she left Evans. And he wound up marrying Phyllis. And everybody kind of begged Phyllis not to marry him because they thought he was not a good person for her. So after 2 months, apparently, she realized that. I go into a couple of details in the book, which I won't go into now, but she left Evans and she went back to Texas to live with her mom and dad at home there. And she took some time off the show after the 78 season, and they didn't know if she was coming back or when she was coming back.
So it was her choice, you're saying?
Yes, absolutely her choice. She left on her own. And it was really not a great time for her to leave because the show was just a roller coaster, destroying the competition. And they had to find a replacement. They put out word to all of the agencies, the modeling agencies, the entertainment agencies. They were looking for a woman to replace Phyllis. And Beano Cook called it the greatest talent hunt since Scarlett O'Hara. They wound up hiring Jane Kennedy, who had quite a bit of experience in Hollywood and doing guest spots on some TV shows, but she had never done any live TV. Jane Kennedy, for your listeners who are unfamiliar, was an absolutely knockdown, gorgeous woman of color who grew up in the Cleveland, Ohio area, idolized Jim Brown as a teenager, and got to be friends with Jim Brown when she moved to Hollywood with her husband, Isaac Kennedy, and got into the business. She was also friends with Ali. They were kind of a power couple out there. And ICM would not put her on the list, telling her they don't want a black and they only want someone who knows sports. Well, she went her own way to get an interview. She got to meet somebody who was in the talent coordinator for CBS. She got on the list of 16 being interviewed in New York. They did a whole day of live interviews. Brent Musburger came in to work with the 16 candidates, and they also brought in a few New York Giants players who they didn't tell the women who they were until right before the interviews. And Jane won the contest. And when Jane thought she had the job after going through all that difficulty of getting ICM to even submit her, she finally won. And then CBS tells her, well, we have to get one more approval. We have to get the approval of the Southern affiliates.
Sure.
And according to Jane, this is according to Jane, they sent the tape of the tryout to the Southern affiliates, and when they told the Southern affiliates that they would move Jimmy the Greek to the set to balance the set with 2 whites and 2 blacks, they approved her hiring. I could not get anyone else from the show in those days to confirm that story, but no one denied it either. For the most part, people like Mike Pearl and Bob Fishman said they were unaware of this happening. This came from a guy by the name of Frank Smith, who was the temporary president of CBS Sports at that time. Jane was on the show for 2 years. Phyllis wound up going back, running into John Y. Brown again at a later time, and meeting him, falling in love with him. On their honeymoon, he mentioned that he was thinking about running for governor. She approved. She went out and campaigned with him. It was easier for her than for him. And he won, and he became governor of the state of Kentucky. And she was the first lady. And after being the first lady for a year or so, apparently she got a little bored, told her agent that she was interested in going back to CBS. CBS wanted her back on the NFL Today. Ted Shaker, who was the new producer of the NFL Today, flew out on a private plane with Van Gordon Sauter, and they met at the private headquarters of John Y. Brown. It wasn't the governor's quarters because that was being rebuilt. It was John Y.'s private home, and which they described as sumptuous. And she couldn't have been any nicer. And the only thing she wanted was to be able to do a few more things that she was interested in. And that included more interview time and more time on the air. And they were thrilled to have her back. She lit up the camera. And the one who was going to get shortchanged on time on the air was going to be Jimmy the Greek. And that was 1980.
And how did, what was the, Jane Kennedy leaving after 2 years? I mean, I'm sure she was not ecstatic to leave that job, although she had a kind of a television acting career prior to and afterwards as well. So did she, what was the dynamic of her leaving the show?
She didn't, I did a very long interview with Jane, and she didn't want to leave. And she felt it was unjust. And, I certainly could understand them wanting to have Phyllis back on. But Jane didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
And I made a case in the book that they could have easily moved her over to Sports Spectacular and to do features for other shows and keep her on the payroll and keep her on the network. I mean, she was an asset. But I also thought that they felt having Jane around would only remind people that by bringing Phyllis back, they got rid of Jane. So they made her disappear. And in order to make her disappear, they had to pay her entire salary for the next year. And here's a good piece of trivia. Her lawyer was Gloria Allred, way back in 1980. Jane went on to do a show called Greatest Sports Legends, I think it was called. She did it for 6 or 7 years, and she was terrific at interviewing the athletes. And then she went on to raise her own family.
All right, I don't want to forget, because there's another real pioneer in this mix too, is Irv Cross. Again, I think it's really interesting. You look at sort of the composition of this. There's groundbreaking going on just about every personality that's part of this show, which just makes it even more groundbreaking in aggregate. But here's a guy, a former player, and somebody, that represents the voice of the player. And I think even at that time, notwithstanding the fact he's African-American, which is also itself pioneering at the time, I think maybe fair to say an unsung hero of this foursome.
Irv was great. Everybody loved Irv. Irv was the hardest working guy in the sports business. When Irv was a player with the Eagles, NFL Films was located in Philadelphia. And he would go over to NFL Films and introduce himself and get to look at film of not just the opponent for that week, all the teams. And he would go in every Monday and he would actually start helping them design freeze frames and defensive schemes to show. And NFL Films loved him, and they recommended him to CBS when Irv was in his last year with the Eagles. He was actually a player coach in his last year. And he had some on-air experience with the local station in Philly doing sports shows at 11:25 at night as part of the newscast. And Irv wound up being the first African-American analyst on games for the CBS network, any NFL game. And he got very, very good at it. I remember Irv telling me a story that when he was a rookie with the Eagles, they asked all the defensive players to write down on a piece of paper what their assignment was. And when they were done to hand it in, they could leave the room. Irv was the last one finished, and everybody else had left the room. And when Irv finally walked up to the coaches in the front, they asked him if he had a problem. And they looked at his paper, and he had written down the assignment for all 11 positions instead of just his own. He was that good. And because he was that smart, he said, that's what we did at Northwestern. And I had to know what everybody did, and I thought that's what you wanted to know. They were so impressed, they made him co-captain. And in the beginning of the season, Irv was in the game, and Chuck Bednarik was still on the Eagles, and it was his job to call defensive. It was Irv's job to call defensive signals. And he was in the huddle, and he looked down. He saw Chuck Bednarik, who was like God in the NFL. And Bednarik, in a gravelly voice, said, "How about it, Ruck? What's it going to be?" And Irv finally gave him the signals, and he just couldn't get over his luck. Now, when Irv was a rookie in 1961, I was a 15-year-old huge Eagle fan, and I got a job selling programs at the Eagles games because it allowed me to get into the stadium free. And after I turned in my cash from selling my 50 programs, I could go up to the top step on the 50-yard line and sit and watch the games. And Irv became an idol of mine, and it was really tremendous 16 years later for me to be working with him. And I told him about it, and he kidded me about it, and he actually thought it was a great thing that we were working together. And when Irv got on the show, Tim Brando was the first studio host of Game Day on ESPN years later. Tim Brando said the combination of Brent Musburger and Irv Cross defined the phrase studio chemistry. Their chemistry together was amazing. Brent could ask Irv a question, and Irv would know exactly how to answer it in the kind of detail that the fans at home understood. Irv was just a pleasure to have there. And when they sent him out to do these interviews, he was great at that too. He was an unsung hero. And it was a shame that eventually they lost the contract after, I think it was 15 or so years to the Fox network. and Irv decided to leave the network. He didn't wait. He didn't know that they were going to get the AFC 4 years later. But Irv was just a great, great person to work with.
Yeah, we just lost Irv earlier this year, sadly, and there's a really it was a really good and unsung, I think, biography called "Bearing the Cross." He came out with a couple of years ago. That was really interesting. Some really interesting stories about not only his television stuff, but his subsequent career in sports athletics at the university and collegiate level. But let me segue from Irv though, because again, he came across as, no pun, as the the coolest head, I guess, in the room, if you will, given the other three, shall we say, combustible personalities.
The Greek was really the match that ignited a lot of stuff. I mean, there was one time in 1977, the Greek thought that John Y. Brown was, I think it was 77, maybe it was 78. And I think Phyllis was married to John Y. at the time. And the Greek claimed that John Y. owed him $100,000 from the Greek's public relations business, and that the Greek had done work for Kentucky Fried Chicken that John Y. never paid him for. And his beef was with John Y. Brown, not with Phyllis. But apparently on the air, the Greek called John Y. a son of a bitch. And the first chance Phyllis had to leave the set, she left the set crying. So that didn't make him very popular. Early on, when Phyllis first came to CBS, even before they assigned her to the NFL Today, they sent her out to do a feature on for the Belmont Stakes. And the Greek was walking the backstretch with her and a producer named Chuck Milton. And finally, after a while, Phyllis pulled Chuck Milton aside and said, "Please tell the Greek to stop using the F word in front of me." She was not a big fan of his, but she got along with him. And eventually things got smoothed over until one Sunday in 1980 when Brent and the Greek went at it.
Yeah, let's talk about that. What was the situation with that? Because that became a cause celeb too for the show. For at least it was almost a storyline for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, more than a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
The Greek had a segment called the Greek Grapevine, where he usually came in with some kind of news. He had been with the network for about 5 years by then, and Brent and the producers were getting a little tired of the Greek coming in with his news being tips from Al Davis that were unconfirmed. So they were not fans of this segment. But this particular Sunday in October of 1980, the Greek had a legitimate piece of news, and that was that Notre Dame was going to fire their coach, Dan Devine, and hire, of all things, a high school coach from Ohio named Jerry Faust. They rehearsed it. Greek thought this was going to be his big moment on the show. And when they went live with it, instead of just throwing it to the Greek and saying, "What do you got for us today?" Brent blurted out the news and left the Greek tongue-tied without much to say after that. It really got the Greek boiled up. And that, combined with him always complaining about not enough airtime, when they ran into each other that night at a place called Pear Trees, it was a bar restaurant on the east side of Manhattan. They wound up at the same table. The Greek kept on complaining to Brent. And according to producer Ted Shaker, Brent had enough and said to the Greek, "You know, Greek, I can make you disappear anytime I want." At that point, the Greek hit Brent in the face. Some people say he slapped him. Some say he punched him. Whatever it was, They got quickly separated. It was too late. It made the Washington Post the next day. It made the New York papers. It was a cause célèbre. During the week, they ironed things out. There was too much at stake. The ratings were too high. Nobody wanted to lose their job over it. Van Gordon Sauter, who was running CBS Sports at the time, thought it was terrific because he knew he'd get a great rating the following Sunday. I was called in to write that show, and we started off with Phyllis ringing a bell like at a boxing match, and their gloves on the table in front of both guys, and Phyllis opened the show by saying round one. And eventually they made up and they got along with each other, and at least on the surface it seemed that way. Of course, that Sunday did get a tremendous rating. But 8 years later, in I think it was August or September of 1988,
Yep.
the Greek appeared on the David Letterman show as a guest. He was there supposedly to talk about the odds for the coming election and talk about what was going to be coming up on the football season. But of course, Letterman asked him about the fight.
How are you and Brent getting along? Wasn't there about 5 years ago you guys got into a scuffle in a bar or something?
Now listen, we've been together for almost 13 years. We're entitled to one argument. I mean, you have that many arguments with your wife every week. No, Brent said something he shouldn't have said, and I did something I shouldn't have done. He and I are the closest of friends. I saw him on your show.
But somebody did get punched, right?
Well, it was about even.
All right, a little punch out. Did you hear that, Paul? We're entitled to one punch out. This is the man you see every, I guess, Saturday and Sunday now, right?
Well, Saturday and Sunday this week, right?
Yeah.
And next week also.
Jimmy the Greek. Pleasure to meet you, Jimmy. Thank you very much.
The Greek said, well, it was about even when Letterman pressed him about it. He said it was about even. Of course, it wasn't even. Greek got in the only punch. And Letterman said, but somebody did get punched out, didn't they? And the Greek said, no, it was about even. We're the best of friends now. And, even every guy and his wife have a fight every once in a while. This is one argument we had in 13 years. And that sounded like a pretty good case the Greek made. 2 months later, the Greek was fired for his controversial comments on Martin Luther King weekend in Washington, D.C. And Brent did not stand up for him. Brent, in fact, wanted him out, according to Ted Shaker. And it turned out they weren't the best of friends after all.
Okay, so obviously a lot of this tension, right? So it's interesting. It doesn't seem like Irv Cross and the Greek had any real beefs, but I mean, or maybe that was also under the surface too, and maybe sort of not there. But I mean,
no,
clearly he seemed to be
none at all.
Okay.
Nobody had a beef with Irv Cross.
Yeah, so that's interesting because it's here you've got two sort of megawatt stars on the show, kind of crossing swords, if you will, with the Greek. What was? All right, let's talk about his ultimate self implosion. We don't have to get into the gritty details of it, but what was it about his personality, Jimmy the Greeks? Because it's clear that I don't want to say he was punching above his celebrity weight, so to speak, right? But it does feel like he kind of didn't sort of care about other people's perceptions of him.
He was having lunch in Duke Siebert's restaurant in Washington, D.C., because they were taping a piece and the camera broke. So it was his bad luck that the camera broke and he wound up at this famous restaurant having lunch on Martin Luther King weekend. It was right before the last game CBS was doing that year, and his contract was about to run out that Sunday. It was up in the air whether they were going to renew his contract. He was going to turn 70 that year, and a lot of people thought CBS was just going to let it lapse and they weren't going to invite him back. But when a local reporter came around with a camera crew asking people what did Martin Luther King mean to them, and he came up to the Greek, and the Greek got into this long soliloquy about the slave owners breeding their slaves to be bigger and stronger, so they could do more work. And that's why blacks are bigger and stronger and faster in the NFL. It got worse than that. And when the guy put it on the air, it was like wildfire across the country. And by that night, the head of the CBS broadcast group, Gene Jankowski, had ordered the Greek to be fired.
Yeah, and I think even Irv Cross. So it's interesting. I think in retrospect, Irv Cross, I think there was a 30 for 30 doc that was about Snyder's life and stuff. And it's interesting that Cross I sort of went out of his way to say he never really even considered Snyder to be a racist. And I think Snyder certainly was apologetic, but I think that there was certainly a boatload of ignorance, I guess, in not only the comments, but also the way he sort of framed them that didn't help his case either.
You know, he wasn't a racist. Jesse Jackson came to try to help him get his job back. You know, what he said actually was printed in Sports Illustrated a few years earlier. These were controversial comments, but they weren't necessarily racist comments. As Phil Mushnick of the New York Post put it, he said what he said wasn't necessarily wrong. He just said it indelicately. And I would tend to agree with that. But the Greek was gone. He was out. And CBS Sports moved on. Brent was read a statement on the field 2 days later that they had fired the Greek.
You know, on Friday afternoon here in Washington, our former colleague Jimmy the Greek made some regrettable and offensive remarks for which he has apologized. Yesterday, CBS issued a statement disassociating itself from those remarks. It goes without saying that his comments do not reflect in any way the thinking or attitudes of the rest of us here at CBS Sports. While we deplore the incident this weekend, we are saddened that our 12-year association with Jimmy had to end this way. And the NFL Today will continue live from RFK Stadium in Washington in just a moment.
And everybody seemed to be pretty happy as they moved forward. Brent only lasted 2 more years at CBS Sports. And the reason for that was in 1990, they were negotiating a new contract for him. He was making $2 million a year at the time, and they weren't afraid to pay him more. What they wanted Brent to do was to ease up and give some of the events that he hosted for CBS to other people. They had Jim Nance in the bullpen. They had Greg Gumbel in the bullpen. They had James Brown in the bullpen. They had Pat O'Brien, who was a very competent host, in the bullpen. And Brent was hosting all these events, the NFL, the NCAA, baseball, which was about to come to CBS, the Masters, the U.S. Open, the Belmont Stakes. And he, apparently, according to Shaker and Neil Pilson, he wouldn't give any of them up. And that's why they thought they needed to start to develop these other people. And they decided not to renew Brent's contract. It leaked out at the Final Four, and a lot of the sports writers thought it was an April Fool's joke. But it was true, and Brent wound up going to ABC, ESPN for the next 27 years.
Okay, I know you got to run, so here's the last question, and I appreciate all of this time because this has been absolutely fascinating, and obviously we're going to tell people to get the book and devour it because this is just so much we could go into. But obviously a lot of this point became moot, right, when CBS lost their NFC rights to Fox later in the 1993, right? 1994, right. 1993, late 93. Put though this show, frankly, in context, right? Obviously, it's for people of today's generation. They sort of maybe to understand again sort of how crucial and game changing, literally and figuratively, this show was. But Can you, in your retrospect, you were in the room, so to speak. Can you kind of encapsulate sort of how important and changing this show was to kind of change what it meant to sort of broadcast NFL football? Because I think it's lost on a whole bunch of people today just how crucially game changing this show was.
Prior to this show, there were only 3 channels. Nothing was live. If the pregame show would come on the air, everything was pre-taped. You were an NFL film. You were starved for information. There was no internet. There was no sports phone even. There was no place to get news. You had to wait for the paper. If you wanted highlights of other games, you had to wait until Howard Cosell presented them on Monday Night Football's halftime. And the NFL today, besides going live and besides doing these fabulous stories and interviews and having these tremendous personalities and having talking about gambling and betting on the games for the first time, besides the show being this exciting, they gave America highlights of other games for the very first time, same day highlights. They found a way to do it. It was an amazing show. It was as if you were seeing live television for the first time. Back in the early 60s, seeing color TV for the first time. That's what it felt like.
All right. The book that must be gotten. It is fantastic. It is called You Are Looking Live, How the NFL Today Revolutionized Sports Broadcasting. It is written by our guest this week, Rich Podolsky. It is forwarded by Jim Nance, and it is available wherever books are found as of October 15th. Depending on when you're listening to this little show, it's either available for pre-order or it's available for regular order. However you choose to get it, just get it, will you? We encourage you perhaps to get it through our web link on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 233 with Rich Podolsky, and you will find a convenient link to Amazon, and we'll get a couple of referral shekels of love. We appreciate that. And of course, you'll get the book about as humanly fast as possible, either in conventional hardcover form or in a Kindle version, which will literally pop up in your device in seconds. But either way you get it, just get it, will you? It's a romp. It's a fantastic read. So many great details, so many unknown little stories and tidbits. Even the most diehard of NFL and television fans will be amazed at the various behind-the-scenes isms from Rich in this wonderful book. It is published by Lions Press. Hey, and while you're there searching around for the book and adding it to your shopping cart there, 2 other great books I can recommend that are also awesome in their own ways. In the realm of music that Rich has written in the past, one's called, is the history, the biography actually, of Don Kirshner. Yes, he of Don Kirshner's rock concert fame. It's called Don Kirshner, the Man with the Golden Ear, with a foreword by Tony Orlando, of all people. I believe Tony Orlando's now got a weekly radio show on WABC AM 77 in New York, right after the Cousin Brucey show on Saturday nights. How about that? The other one's a biography of Neil Sedaka. It's called Neil Sedaka, Rock and Roll Survivor, with a foreword by none other than Elton John. I mean, so Rich knows what he's doing with this stuff. These are all fantastic reads. And whether you're into sports or music, Rich has got you covered with all 3 of those titles. And feel free, like I said again, to go through our link on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com to order such. And many copies of such, why not? Makes great gifts, why not? While you're on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, you, of course, we will see every past, present, and we think future episodes of this show. Of course, the best, most efficient way is to subscribe or follow a feed in your favorite podcatcher or podcast app. But somehow, if that eludes you, or you want to just, tease a couple of friends into maybe, a a little sampler platter. Well, they'll have every stinking episode on our website. There's a nice search engine there, pretty robust. You can kind of search up a team or a league or a name or something, whatever, and God forbid, you may actually find something either that you didn't know we did, or your friends might just be tantalized into subscribing or following us as well. So however you bring people there, that's a great place to start. It's kind of a gateway, if you will. And it's also the place where you'll find all the other information about this show, like our social media feeds. We're on Facebook at Good Seats Still Available. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. And on Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. Would you like to send us some email? Well, please go right ahead. Yeah, we're at we're at hello@Good Seats Still Available. My name's Tim, but the email address, that's not going to help you at all. It's hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. There you go. And what else? Oh, hey, we have an email newsletter that we send out each and every week, usually on Sunday afternoons, Sunday evenings, depending on how efficient we are in putting our pieces together each week. And what do you get with that? Well, it's you give us your name and your email address. That's it. We don't share it with anybody. We'll give you a little bit of a head start, a couple hours ahead of time as to what we're going to be talking about that week, and maybe give you a little bit of an early access to said show. And let's see, two things we want to do before we wrap up. One is, of course, thank kindly our good pal, Dr. Jerry Payne in Atlanta, GA. Thank you, sir, for all your work this week, of course. Cannot do this show without your help. And we're going to leave you, of course, as we try to do when it's appropriate, some musical send-off. And I think probably the most appropriate way to send you off, I think it makes sense. Why not? How about the full-fledged NFL Today theme from back in the day? Now, just so you know, it's actually called, the official name of this theme, it's called Horizontal Hold. And it's by a guy named Jack Trombe, which is actually not a real name. It's actually an anagram or a pseudonym of somebody named Jan Stockert. I don't even know if that's even a guy. It could be a female for all I know. But whatever, it is that person in the mix putting it all together. And in actuality, it's actually a production music bed from a music library known as the DeWolf Music Library. So there you go. More trivia than you ever wanted to know. But let's just regale in it in all its 3.5 minutes of stereophonic glory. Let's send you out, and we'll see you next week. Here it is, the official and full original NFL Today theme. Goodbye, everybody. Have a good week. Bye.